Bodies floated among the waves, bloated, unrecognizable. On the beach, the smell of burning flesh mingled with that of broken coral and gunpowder. Screams, flames, boiling blood on hot rock. And yet, that was only the beginning. Okinawa wasn't a battle. It was a slaughterhouse designed to swallow two entire powers alive. More than 180,000 American soldiers unleashed on a tiny island, infested with tunnels, traps, and soldiers ready to die killing. The Japanese didn't defend the coast, they let them in. And when the enemy thought they had won, the real hell began. It was 82 days of slow death, without respite, without mercy. And when it was over, there was nothing left. No cities, no bodies, no humanity. But to understand how this hell came to be, you have to go back to the previous months, to the offices where the maps were drawn, and to the men who knew that the next battle, would be the bloodiest in the Pacific. The road to hell. The spring of 1945 found the Allies holding the initiative in the Pacific. The dark days of 1941 to 42 were over. A succession of victorious offensives had recaptured much of the territory that the Japanese Empire had occupied during the first months of the war, and the question was no longer who would win, but when the final battle would come and how many lives it would cost to end the conflict. The Allied strategy rested on three major converging axes. In the far north, US forces, with Canadian support, cleared the Aleutian Islands of Alaska of the Japanese. In the southwest, General Douglas MacArthur led a combined contingent of US, Australian and New Zealand troops supported by the 3rd and 7th Fleets and land-based aircraft. He first secured the US-Australia line of communications, then captured the Solomon Islands with Rabaul as his target, and advanced along the northern coast of New Guinea to the Philippines. In the Central Pacific, the 5th Fleet seized the Gilbert Islands in late 1943 and, after neutralizing the air strongholds of Rabaul and Truk, seized the Marshall Islands in early 1944. The next target, the Marianas, proved a decisive blow. The fall of Saipan and Tinian in July and the liberation of Guam in August caused such political upheaval in Tokyo that Prime Minister Shigenori Togo resigned and a new cabinet was formed. In October 1944, MacArthur landed on Leyte at the head of the 6th Army, and by year's end he had several strongholds in the vast Philippine archipelago. The islands would be declared liberated on July 5, 1945, 2 weeks after Okinawa was secured. Meanwhile, the 3rd Fleet maintained constant pressure between February and March 1945. The Japanese High Command sensed the next step but did not know the exact point of impact. It considered Formosa, the Chinese mainland, or the Okinawa chain, and simultaneously reinforced all three areas while the US 5th Fleet and 10th Army concentrated forces on the Pacific Island bases. The strategic debate had begun a year earlier. In May 1944, during the lull prior to the conquest of the Marianas, Admiral Ernest J. King met in San Francisco with Chester W. Nimitz and William F. Halsey to discuss the final phase of the war. There was concern that Japan might attempt a separate peace with an exhausted nationalist China. Nimitz proposed establishing bridgeheads on the Chinese coast to open supply routes that would force Tokyo to divert troops to the mainland. In that scheme, the invasion of Formosa, 1,080 kilometers southwest of Japan, would bypass the Philippines, launch long-range bombers against the home archipelago, and protect the lines to China. Formosa offered operational advantages, a base for mainland attacks, convoy protection, a platform for B-29s, but it also entailed risks. It was within range of Japanese aircraft based in China, housed a strong garrison, could be quickly reinforced, and had rugged mountainous terrain almost as extensive as Kyushu. As the Marianas campaign drew to a close in July 1944, Roosevelt summoned Nimitz and MacArthur. The latter rejected the idea of bypassing the Philippines and assured them that, with additional naval support, they could be liberated. An alternative plan was then agreed upon, to recapture much of the archipelago between October and December 1944, and then decide whether to attack Luzon in February 1945 or the Formosa-Amoy area in March, followed by the Bonin in April and the Ryukyus, including Okinawa, in May. MacArthur, true to his 1942 promise, insisted on returning to Manila. Shortly thereafter, Lieutenant General Millard F. Harmon presented a compelling case for ruling out Formosa. The campaign would absorb forces unsustainable, the air routes were exposed to Chinese interception, and the weather was unfavorable. He proposed instead occupying Iwo Jima in January and Okinawa in June, concurrent with the landing on Luzon. General Robert C. Richardson and other key commanders concurred. General Simon B. Buckner warned that there were insufficient troops to secure a beachhead on Formosa, and Admiral Raymond A. Spruance also advised avoiding it. In October, Nimitz conveyed to King the unanimous opinion of his subordinates. The Joint Chiefs of Staff Committee ordered MacArthur to land on Luzon on December 20, 1944, and Nimitz to attack Iwo Jima on January 20, 1945, and Okinawa on March 1. This operation, prior to the planned invasion of Japan, was dubbed Iceberg. The Ryukyu Islands were codenamed Bunkhouse and Okinawa Scattering. With the Philippines secured, Japanese forces in the East Indies would be isolated. From the Marianas, B-29s could hammer Japan without fear of interceptor bases in the Ryukyus. American airfields in that arc would protect the flank, harass Formosa and the mainland, and launch attacks on the home archipelago. The capture of Iwo Jima, the midpoint between the Marianas and Honshu, would allow fighters to escort the bombers and offer them emergency landing ranges. Meanwhile, the 3rd Fleet and 3rd Amphibious Corps assaulted Palau in September 1944 to cover MacArthur's eastern flank. The 5th Fleet and 5th Amphibious Corps struck Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945, and after fierce fighting that lasted until March 16, the first iceberg actions were unleashed, delayed by the resistance on Iwo Jima. The Ryukyu Islands form an island arc that curves from Kyushu across the East China Sea to Formosa. 161 islands are grouped into 5 chains: Osumi, Tokara, Amami, Okinawa, and Sakishima, which form a natural bridge to the south. The heart of the chain is Okinawa, the largest and most important part. The Okinawa archipelago includes several satellite groups around the main island: Keramareto to the west, Kume and Aguni further out, Iishima to the northwest, Yagachi and Ioroma to the north and northeast, and a scattered eastern group that the Americans would call the Eastern Isles. All would play a significant role in the campaign. Okinawa lies 560 kilometers southwest of Kyushu, the same number northeast of Formosa, and about 725 kilometers from the Chinese coast. It shares the Japanese time zone, which the U.S. Navy designated Item or Zulu 9. The island's history is a mosaic of influences. Chinese fleets plundered it intermittently from the 6th to the 7th centuries, demanding tribute without exercising full sovereignty. In 1368, the Ryukyu king formally assumed this subordination, although he maintained dealings with Japan and a degree of autonomy. When he refused to contribute troops to Japan's war against Korea in 1609, the samurai invaded and razed the kingdom, which became a dual vassal of China and Japan. In 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry anchored there during his expedition to open Japan, and the American flag flew next to Shuri Castle, a harbinger of future battles. Meiji modernization granted Okinawa prefectural status in 1879. Despite local resistance and Chinese demands, it was integrated into the Empire of the Rising Sun, with parliamentary representation since 1920. In 1943, it was administratively included within the district of Kyushu. Geographically, Okinawa-shima stretches 145 kilometers from northeast to southwest. Its width varies: 29 kilometers on the Motobu Peninsula in the north and barely 3 kilometers on the Ishikawa Isthmus near the center. To the south, several smaller peninsulas delimit natural anchorages. The isthmus divides the island into 2 contrasting regions. The sparsely inhabited north is a labyrinth of jungle-covered ridges, 300 to 580 meters high, crisscrossed by deep ravines that drain into the sea. The dense cover of pine, juniper, oak, and bamboo restricted movement and offered excellent defensive positions. Only a single track bordered the northwest coast. Beyond this, traffic was impossible. The much more populated south features rolling hills rising up to 150 meters and cut by narrow, poorly drained streams. Caves excavated by underground streams pierced the hills and ridges. As one advances toward the capital, the terrain breaks into small outcrops and irregular slopes incorporated by Japanese engineers into successive short-range defensive lines. The landscape lacks broad firing ranges and favors short-range weapons. 4/5 of the southern surface was cultivated with sweet potatoes, sugarcane, rice, and soybeans, Fishing supplemented the economy. Villages and hamlets were linked by single-track roads, many of them made of dirt or crushed coral. Only a two-lane limestone highway connected Naha and Shuri, and the mud made it impassable during the rainy season. Off-road military traffic was virtually impossible. A 60-centimetre narrow-gauge railway connected Naha with the interior, but its capacity was insufficient for the logistical requirements of a large-scale operation. Against this backdrop, a crossroads of air routes, a strategic junction between the China Sea and the open Pacific, a historically disputed and inherently difficult territory, rose the last barrier before the Japanese metropolitan archipelago. With Iwo Jima secured and the Philippines liberated, the Allied gaze turned to Okinawa. The key that would close the clamp on Japan and, with its ferocity, herald the devastation of the war's final stretch. Plans for the battle. The collapse of the Japanese position in the Pacific had become evident by early 1945. Following the aerial neutralization of the Truk fortress in February 1944 and the subsequent fall of Saipan, Tinian and Guam during the summer, Japan's outer defensive arc was broken. Iwo Jima fell to the United States between February and March 1945. Most of the islands conquered in the triumphant months of 1941 to 42 were once again under Allied control or subjected to constant bombardment that forced their garrisons to live in caves and tunnels. Scattered remnants of the Imperial Army held out in the Philippines, but much of the Imperial Navy was already at the bottom of the Pacific, and its once fearsome naval aircraft had virtually ceased to exist. American submarines had strangled supply routes, and B-29s dropped explosive and incendiary bombs on Japan's congested cities, fueling the sense of impending catastrophe. Certain that the Allies would strike at Formosa or the Ryukyu Range, the Japanese General Staff devised a strategy aimed at forcing a bloody draw. They believed the Japanese spirit would hold up against the overwhelming firepower and unlimited resources of the United States, and by inflicting unacceptable losses, would bring about a negotiated peace. Japanese doctrine, based on an uncompromising offensive spirit of Bushido and validated, they believed, by experience in China, had suffered severe setbacks in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, but the military leadership still clung to the idea that individual courage could compensate for material inferiority. From these convictions grew the tactics of echelon defense in depth, concrete bunkers embedded in the terrain, and finally the use of suicide attacks, kamikaze, Toko aircraft, kikusui explosive boats, and suicide bombings with personal explosives. The ground plan was delegated to the 32nd Army, deployed on Okinawa since April 1944 following Operation Tengo, which had envisioned a network of mutual air bases on Formosa and the Ryukyu to harass any invading force. By the time it came to a standstill, the 32nd Army had fielded some 100,000 troops, 2 depleted infantry divisions, several independent brigades, a motley mix of field and coastal artillery, sappers and service troops. General Mitsuru Ushijima, a cautious and methodical officer, rejected the initial idea of defending the beaches, an approach that had failed in the Gilberts, Marshalls and Marianas, and chose instead to concentrate his efforts on the southern half of the island, where the broken terrain, limestone escarpments and labyrinthine hills offered a defense in depth. The north, covered by inaccessible jungle, was garrisoned only by a screen of the 44th Independent Mixed Brigade. It was terrain that consumed troops without offering a decisive advantage and could be abandoned without compromising the main objective, to wear down the enemy in a prolonged battle. Consequently, the western beaches where the landing was expected were intentionally left lightly defended. The main forces erected extensive lines of trenches, artillery caves, and machine gun nests around the Shuri Massif and the narrow line of the Chatan Isthmus, the point where the island narrowed to a mere 5 kilometers in width. This was the convergence of the approaches to Naha and Shuri, the civilian capital and administrative center, and the 2 key airfields of Yontan and Kadena, which the Japanese considered to be priority invasion targets. South of this line were the final positions, the steep Urasoe Mura Ridge, Tanabaru, and the complex natural labyrinth of Shuri Yonabaru, the point where Ushijima planned to fight the decisive battle. Thousands of firing points, concrete bunkers, galleries dug into coral rock, and interconnected cave complexes were fortified with short-range weapons and protected by thick embrasures. The objective was simple: force the Americans to advance hill by hill, burrow by burrow, paying for every meter in blood and time until their will was broken. The Japanese naval contribution was structured around the desperate use of suicidal means. The Imperial fleet concentrated 4 regiments of Shinyo launches and more than 100 Koryu and Kaiten manned torpedoes at Kerama-Reto off the southwest coast of Okinawa. Admiral Matome Ugaki hoped to launch Kikusui, chrysanthemum flower, waves of kamikaze aircraft from Kyushu, Formosa, and the countryside of Okinawa itself to sink transports and aircraft carriers in the critical phase of the landing. It was estimated that a single transport loaded with ammunition or troops lost on the beach would create a logistical bottleneck sufficient to jeopardize the entire operation. On the other side, the Joint Expeditionary Force, Task Force 51, under Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, faced the reverse challenge: gather intelligence, devise a plan, and transport an army more than 6,000 miles from the American West Coast. The first photographic reconnaissance over Okinawa, conducted during B-29 bombing raids in September 1944, was partially obscured by cloud cover. Only during the October attacks was complete coverage obtained that revealed the southern defensive structure. Although the 32nd Army concealed its positions well and limited daylight movements, analysts estimated by March 1945 the presence of 75,000 troops organized into divisions under deep fortifications south of the Ishikawa Isthmus. The Iceberg plan took shape in 3 phases. The first called for the occupation of the Kerama-Reto Island Group, 15 miles off the west coast, during the last week of March. There, the 77th Infantry Division would gain safe anchorage to repair damaged ships, rearm escort vessels, and establish an advanced anti-submarine base. On March 26th, prior to the main landing, the 77th Division's 2nd Battalion seized Aishima Heights, a strategic island controlling the approaches to Yontan and Kadena Island, and where the celebrated correspondent Ernie Pyle would later die. At the same time, minesweepers and auxiliary boats would begin extensive mine clearance from the southern coast to secure the transport corridors. The second phase, the amphibious assault, was scheduled for 8:30 a.m. on April 1, 1945, dubbed L-Day. It would be the largest landing ever carried out in the Pacific Theater. 2 Marine divisions, 1st and 6th, and 2 Army divisions, 7th and 96th, would enter an 8-mile strip of western beaches, code blue and orange between Hagushi and the mouth of the Bishi River, with the 3rd Amphibious Corps on the left and the 24th Corps on the right. The 6th Marine Division would secure Yontan. The 7th Army Division would secure Kadena. Behind them, the 27th and 81st Divisions would remain as a floating reserve, ready to exploit any breakthrough or reinforce critical sectors. Meanwhile, the 2nd Marine Division would fake a landing on the Motobu Peninsula to tie up Japanese reserves. At sea, over 1,300 ships provided cover. The carriers of the fast strike forces TF-58 and TF-57 pounded airfields on Kyushu, Formosa, and the Ryukyus to slow kamikaze attacks, while battleships, cruisers, and destroyers pounded coastal positions with thousands of tons of shellfire. 22 carrier escorts provided combat air patrol for the invasion force. Despite this, the suicidal threat materialized. Between 6th April and 22nd June, the Kikusui launched 10 major waves, severely damaging the battleship Maryland, sinking the carrier Bunker Hill and numerous destroyers and transports. With the 3rd phase, breaking through the isthmus and advancing south, complete, the 24th Corps was to pivot east, capture the Chinan Peninsula, and block any Japanese withdrawal, while the 3rd Corps would turn toward Motobu and the northern mountains to clear their rear. With the airfields in Allied hands, fighters and medium bombers would operate from Okinawa itself, intensifying the air encirclement of the Japanese metropolis. The logistics of such an undertaking were colossal. The ports and anchorages supporting the operation stretched from Espiritu Santo and Guadalcanal in the heart of the South Pacific to Ulithi and Leyte in the west, passing through Pearl Harbor and the California coast. The distance from Pearl Harbor to Okinawa alone, 6,200 miles, required 26 days of sailing for cargo convoys. A total of 458 transport ships were assembled to carry troops, vehicles, and supplies. The ammunition consumption rate was estimated to be more than 3 times that used in the Marianas. In addition, 4 large airfields were planned on Okinawa itself, and extensive supply facilities at Nakagusuku 1, which would permanently transform the human geography of the island. Japan, aware of its lack of strategic reserves and a deep-sea fleet, relied heavily on attrition. Ushijima ordered his engineers to barely show their firing ports so as not to reveal their positions, to use the topography as a shield, and to adapt each cave into a fort. More than 60 miles of tunnels linked shelters and command posts. Inside, troops stored months' worth of supplies, prepared to survive a prolonged siege. The operational motto was captured in the 32nd Army's crude combat report: 1 plane against every ship, 1 boat against every transport, 1 man for every 10 enemy ships or for every tank. When the amphibious waves stormed into Hagushi on April 1st, they encountered surprisingly little direct opposition. The Japanese gamble, as the following weeks would reveal, was not to stem the tide on sand, but to slowly strangle it amid coral rock, sodden jungle, and the fanatical sacrifice of its defenders. U.S. forces. The amphibious force that was to conquer Okinawa was organized around Task Force 51, dubbed the Joint Expeditionary Force. It was a self-sufficient organization. It could operate for 30 days without outside support and wage coordinated actions at sea, in the air, and on land. TF-51, in turn, was part of Task Force 50, Raymond Spruance's 5th Fleet, and was supported by 2 formidable aircraft carrier squadrons, Mark Mitchell's TF-58, with 88 ships, 11 fleet carriers, and 6 light carriers supported by 7 battleships, and Bernard Rawlings's British TF-57, which added 4 aircraft carriers and 2 capital ships of its own. Under the umbrella of TF-51, 7 task forces were deployed. TF-52, William Blandy, provided close support with escort carriers, aircraft from the 31st and 33rd Marine Squadrons, a flotilla of over 60 minesweepers and underwater demolition teams. The Western Islands Attack Group, TG-51.1, Ingolf Kieland, captured Karama-Reto and neighboring Aishima before L-Day. Task Force 53 and 55, Lawrence Reifsnyder and John Hall, transported the 3rd Amphibious Corps and 24th Army Corps. Task Force 54, Morton Deo, provided naval gunfire with battleships and cruisers. A demonstration group would fake a landing to the south to pin down enemy reserves. And finally, TF-56, Simon B. Buckner's Expeditionary Troops, controlled all ground forces. That ground component was the 10th Army, activated in June 1944, and the only joint command of the war comprising an Army Corps, 24, and a Marine Corps, 3rd Air Command. It comprised 102,000 Army soldiers, 88,000 Marines, and some 18,000 construction Marines, Seabees and medical personnel. A total of 182,821 men landed on L-Day. To protect them from Japanese aircraft, the 10th Army deployed the 53rd Anti-Aircraft Brigade, 5 AAA groups with 90 and 40 mm guns, and reinforced its rear with military police and civilian government units, lessons learned on Saipan and Tinian. The later-trained 24th Corps, commanded by John Hodge, featured the 7th and 96th Infantry Divisions as its spearhead and boasted unprecedented corps artillery. 14 battalions that would use the 203 mm howitzer for the first time in the Pacific. The veteran 27th Division traveled as a floating reserve. The 77th would arrive after fighting in the northern Ryukyus. The 3rd Amphibious Corps, Roy Geiger, carried the 1st Marine Division, 26,000 men, a veteran of Guadalcanal and Peleliu, and the brand new 6th Marine Division, created on Guadalcanal with experienced troops from the provisional brigades. The 2nd Marine Division remained on Saipan as a demonstration force and eventual reinforcement. Although the Army and Marine divisions shared the same triadic structure, they differed in strength and armament. The armies numbered around 14,000 and the Marines 19,000, but the Marines were more heavily armed. Each Marine regiment reorganized in 1945 had 6 105mm self-propelled howitzers, 37mm anti-tank guns, and abundant automatic weapons. Its sapper company included M2 flamethrowers and M9A1 bazookas. The Army, for its part, compensated for its lower density of fire with more powerful field artillery and a larger armoured fleet. 7 tank battalions with M4A3s or M4A2s, one of them a flamethrower, plus 3 battalions of 75mm LVT of 4 amphibious tanks. Tactical air support was centralized in the Tactical Air Force, 10th Army, Tango Golf 99.2, created in November 1944, and commanded by Major General Francis Mulcahy. Initially, it relied on 51 escort carriers, but as the Yontan and Kadena airfields were brought into service, it was expanded to include over 750 aircraft from the U.S. Navy, the 2nd Marine Air Wing, and the U.S. Army Air Forces, tasked with photo reconnaissance, kamikaze attacks, and close support. With this naval, land, and air force, more than 1,300 ships and nearly 190,000 combatants ready to decimate the Shuri fortress, the Americans aspired not only to conquer Okinawa, but to turn it into a forward base from which to strike at the very heart of Imperial Japan. The Japanese forces. At the beginning of 1944, Okinawa was down to the Nakagusuku 1 coastal artillery unit and a few guard detachments, but everything changed when the Japanese High Command created the 32nd Army on April 1st of that year. Its arrival turned the island into a veritable entrenched camp. The first major contingent was the veteran 9th Division, transferred from Manchuria in June while Saipan was burning under the bombs. At the end of that same month, the 600 survivors of the 44th Independent Mixed Brigade arrived, rescued after the loss of their transport with 5,000 men on board. In July, the 15th Independent Mixed Regiment was incorporated by air, the first Japanese operation of such magnitude. In August, the 62nd Division landed from China, and with the withdrawal of the 9th in December, the best-prepared unit became Lieutenant General Tatsumi Amamiya's 24th Division, a triangular formation of 3 infantry regiments supported by 150mm heavy artillery, sappers, reconnaissance, and transports. The 32nd Army also had 2 modernized independent brigades on Kyushu, the 2nd and 15th IMR, each with 3 infantry battalions and a 75mm anti-tank company. To reinforce the firepower, the 5th Army Artillery Group combined the power of 36 150mm howitzers, 8 240mm heavy mortars, 24 320mm rocket launchers, and 96 81mm mortars. In parallel, the 21st Anti-Aircraft Group assembled 72 75mm and 54 20mm guns to protect airfields and coastal emplacements. Armored capabilities were modest but valuable. The 27th Tank Regiment fielded 18 Chi-Ha medium tanks and 14 Ha-Go light tanks, while the anti-tank battalions included newly manufactured 47mm guns. The 11th Shipping Group operated an amphibious battalion and acted as an emergency landing force, and the 1st Marine Engineering Group kept ports ready for reinforcements. Mobilization was multi-pronged. In June 1944, 20 labor battalions, Boitai, were formed with 16,600 Okinawans to dig trenches and roadways. Later, civilian defense organizations, Keibutai, were added, responsible for putting out fires and maintaining order. On January 1, 1945, the recruitment of up to 39,000 additional civilians between the ages of 17 and 45 was authorized, and more than 12,000 women worked in rear services. These were joined by 5,000 Okinawan conscripts integrated into regular units, and some 12,000 workers and sailors employed in the construction of bunkers, caves, and gun nests. The Imperial Navy also reinforced the operation. 3,825 men, including 6,000 civilian employees, organized the Oroku Naval Base with coastal companies armed with 120 and 140mm guns, an 81mm anti-aircraft battery, and several service units. The Shinyo Suicide Torpedo Boat Detachment and Explosive Boat Regiments completed the maritime component. In total, the 32nd Army administered some 100,000 Army combatants, 3,800 Marines, and nearly 40,000 laborers and auxiliaries, a mix of China-hardened regular divisions, brigades rebuilt from the remnants of other campaigns, large-caliber artillery, and a network of local manpower. These forces, burrowed into networks of caves, limestone drifts, and deep-set concrete pillboxes, were intended to turn the southern half of Okinawa into a slaughterhouse capable of wearing down a vastly superior enemy and buying the Empire time in its dying hours. The first bombs. The skies over Okinawa first felt the weight of war on September 29, 1944, when squadrons of B-29s attacked its airfields. More than destruction, they intended to photograph the island and its surroundings for a future invasion. On October 10th, the first carrier-based raid arrived. Its aim was to eliminate the air threat to the imminent offensive on Leyte and ended in the so-called Air Battle of Formosa, where Japan lost 500 aircraft and 36 ships in 3 days. After an autumn respite, the new year opened with a devastating blow on January 3rd. A week later, the fast carrier force returned and linked those actions with bombing raids on Formosa and the Chinese coast. Until the end of February, Task Force 58 punished the Tokyo region and, while retreating toward Ulithi, unleashed another brutal barrage on Okinawa on March 1st. American submarines and reconnaissance patrols shut down traffic between Japan, Formosa, and the Ryukyu Islands, sinking dozens of merchant ships. Between attacks on the metropolitan archipelago, B-29s repeatedly returned to Okinawa. By late March, almost no Japanese aircraft remained operational in the area. Naha, its harbor, and the palace city of Shuri were reduced to rubble. From March 18th to 31st, further attacks on Kyushu airfields and warships finalized preparations for Iceberg. A Japanese counterattack severely damaged the aircraft carrier Franklin but failed to dislodge the fleet. On March 24th, 16, 14, and 12-inch battleships, escorted by cruisers, destroyers, and 177 gunboats, destroyed a convoy of 8 merchant ships northwest of the island and pounded the coastal defenses. Between the 26th and the 31st, the British fleet neutralized the Sakishima Gunto airfields. Meanwhile, TF-52's minesweeping flotilla began clearing the approaches on 22nd March. 122 vessels swept 7,800 square kilometers of sea, found 6 minefields, and destroyed 257 ordnance. On 25th March, the bombardment and covering force approached with 3 16-inch battleships, 5 14-inch battleships, and 1 12-inch battleship supported by lighter naval artillery. In the week before L-Day, they fired 37,000 5-inch or larger shells, 33,114 mm rockets, and 22,500. The landings begin. The final assault on Okinawa began to take shape months before the landing. On September 29, 1944, a formation of B-29s bombed the island's airfields and, above all, photographed it from end to end to complete the aerial mapping. On October 10th, the aircraft carriers of Task Force 58 attacked again in the so-called Air Battle of Formosa, a strike designed to eliminate any threat before the Leyte campaign. There were few pauses. On January 3, 1945, TF-58 launched 500 aircraft and 36 ships against Okinawa. On January 10th, it returned with another coordinated salvo, including raids on Formosa and the Chinese coast. On March 1st, as it retreated to Ulithi, it bombed the island again, and between March 18th and 31st, it pounded the Kyushu airfields while the British force neutralized those on Sakishima. The Japanese counterattacked with aircraft and nearly sank the aircraft carrier USS Franklin, but failed to halt the offensive. On March 25th, Operation Tengo was activated, and 2 days later, B-29s paralyzed the Kyushu airfields, grounding most of the enemy aircraft. Simultaneously, the minesweeping flotilla, TG-52.2, began clearing the approaches on March 22nd. 122 ships searched 3,000 square kilometers of sea, discovered 6 minefields, and destroyed 257 ordnance. On March 25th, the battleships and cruisers of the covering group fired 37,127 mm shells, 114 mm rockets, and over 22,000 mortar rounds. Carrier-based aircraft flew 3,100 sorties. The defenders, hunkered down in dugouts, barely responded. The first land landing took place on March 26th. Kiramaretto, a cluster of rugged islands 24 kilometers west of Okinawa, offered an anchorage capable of accommodating more than 70 ships. The 77th Infantry Division swept the archipelago and found 350 intact suicide boats. Only 4 Japanese batteries offered resistance. 531 defenders were killed and 121 prisoners captured. More than 1,200 civilians were interned and about 150 people committed suicide. That same day, Kaisashima fell, where 155mm howitzers were emplaced that a week later would pound the Shuri positions. Meanwhile, UDT teams reconnoitered the Higuchi beaches and cleared obstacles in 21 degrees Celsius waters. April 1st, Easter Sunday and April Fool's Day, was designated L Day. At 4:30, Vice Admiral Kelly Turner ordered the landing force launched. More than 1,300 ships anchored off the west coast. Half an hour later, a cover bombardment dropped 25 shells per 100 yards of frontage. At 8 o'clock, gun-toting LCIs breached the reef, and hundreds of LVTs began the 12,000 feet to the beach line. 2 groups of 64 fighter bombers swept the coastal fringe. The 2nd Marine Division feigned an assault to the southeast to divert reserves, but the Japanese refused to rise. The first wave passed the battleship USS Tennessee and landed at 8:30 without serious opposition. In the first hour, 50,000 troops landed. The immediate defenses were pulverized and the Japanese 1st Special Forces were disbanded. By 2 p.m., after the arrival of support units, the beachhead measured 13 kilometers wide by 5 kilometers deep. That day, the 4 assault divisions recorded only 28 dead, 27 missing, and 104 wounded. With Yontan and Kadena airfields in Allied hands, operational for emergencies at L+2, the advance accelerated. On April 4th, the 6th Marine Division turned north. The 1st and 7th Infantry Divisions closed the narrow Ishikawa Isthmus, and the 96th turned south. The Allied command wondered where the enemy was. On April 6th, Emperor Jimmu, Tokyo announced that Okinawa would be recaptured. 2 days later, Prime Minister Koiso resigned, and on the 7th, Admiral Suzuki took over with the task of finding an honorable exit. The Japanese response came on April 4th, when General Hodge ordered the 7th and 96th Divisions to attack the Shuri line. The Japanese 62nd Division, supported by artillery positioned on the heights, pounded the plain and the approaches to Higuchi. Between April 6th and 8th, the Americans seized Cactus, Kaniku, and Tombstone ridges. On the 6th, they took the Needle, where Commodore Perry had raised his flag in 1853. Kakazu Ridge held out fiercely. The Americans suffered 1,500 casualties compared to 4,500 Japanese. On April 12th at 7 p.m., the 24th Division launched a counterattack covered by a brief bombardment. Poorly coordinated, it ended in carnage and delayed the Allied offensive for only a few days. That same night, the death of Franklin D. Roosevelt was announced, news that shook the troops. While the 15th Corps was bleeding before Shuri, the 3 Amphibious Corps was mopping up the north. On April 6th, the 6th Marine Division, reinforced by the 29th Regiment, advanced toward the Motobu Peninsula. The Udo Force, 1,500 men from the 44th Mixed Brigade, dug into Mount Ye Take, a 9 by 6 kilometer stronghold. After days of skirmishing, the decisive assault began on April 14th and ended on the 17th with 700 defenders dead. Resistance dissolved in night ambushes. Many Okinawans, persuaded by propaganda, fought alongside the Imperial troops. On May 4th, the 27th Division relieved the exhausted Marines. The 27th Regiment swept through Onna Tak between June and July. On August 4th, the northern sector was declared secure. More than 1,000 Japanese had died, and half 1,000 had surrendered. All that remained was Ieshima, a 9 by 4 kilometer island located opposite Motobu. Dominated by the 185-meter-high Igusugu limestone peak and equipped with 3 airfields nearly 2 kilometers long, it was a key forward fighter base. With 8,000 inhabitants, 3,000 of whom had already been evacuated, it featured 30-meter-high cliffs to the north and segmented beaches to the south. American forces landed on April 16th and, after fierce fighting, secured the position on the 21st, completing the aerial encirclement that, from Okinawa, definitively sealed the fate of the Japanese Empire. The capture of Shima, completed on April 21st, did not mean the end of the scares. Even as engineers were laying the first runways for escort fighters, Task Force 51 continued to cover the troops with air patrols, kamikaze interceptions, reconnaissance and floating hospitals, while the 5th and 3rd Fleets pounded airfields in the Ryukyu Islands, Formosa and Kyushu. On April 6th, with the beachhead consolidated, Japan launched its most dramatic blow, Operation Ten-Ichi. The battleship Yamato, escorted by the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers, sailed without fuel to return. It was to run aground south of the Hagushi beaches and bombard the transports at point-blank range. American submarines and aircraft shadowed the group. At noon on April 7th, TF-58 aircraft destroyed it with 10 torpedoes and 5 bombs. The Yamato broke in two, taking 2,487 crew members to the bottom. 4 destroyers reached Japan, the rest were left adrift or sunk. At the same time, the largest wave of kamikaze attacks of the war was unleashed on Okinawa. 355 aircraft attacked between April 6th and 7th, and although they sank 6 ships and damaged 21 with more than 500 American casualties, they paid with more than 1,100 aircraft shot down. From then on, 9 more Shogo waves kept up the pressure until June, mixing suicide attacks with conventional bombing. Of the 1,900 aircraft involved, 225 sank or damaged 86 ships, but the sea remained open for convoys. Meanwhile, the 24th Corps was digging into the Japanese mainline, anchored on the ridges and escarpments protecting the fortress city of Shuri. Since April 14th, the 7th, 96th and 27th Divisions had remained stationary, accumulating ammunition for the assault scheduled for April 19th. That morning, after an artillery preparation by 27 battalions and relentless aerial bombardment, the 7th Division swung against Skyline Ridge, the 96th collided with Tombstone and Nishibaru, and the 27th groped its way through the mouth of the Makinato, where the 193rd Tank Battalion lost 22 tanks in a neck of ground. For a week, the 3 fronts gained barely 1,300 meters. Kakazu, Nishibaru, and the Uraso-Mura escarpment absorbed men and armor like sponges. Only the arrival of the Bradford Task Force, a reserve of flame tanks and sappers, made it possible to burst the concrete nests. By April 24th, the Kakazu fortress was behind us, but the enemy had committed its last reserves and remained crouched in the Shuri tunnels. On the night of May 2nd to 3rd, the Shuri underground was abuzz with discussion. Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, operations officer of the 32nd Army, insisted on maintaining the defensive attrition tactic. But pressure from many regimental commanders eager to die advancing, and the shortage of food and ammunition prompted General Isamu Cho to authorize an all-out counterattack. The plan, drafted in a few hours, committed virtually all remaining operational forces. The 24th Division, 22nd, 32nd and 89th Regiments would strike on the western front between Makinato Inlet and the Uraso-Emura escarpment, while the 62nd Army, mainly its 1st and 2nd Regiments, would strike on the eastern front 63rd Brigade and the 272nd, 273rd and 275th Independent Battalions would strike eastward on the Tanabaru and Nishibaru ridges. To support the breakthrough, the 27th Tank Regiment was to launch about 20 Type 97 Chihas across the valley separating Kakazu and Nishibaru, and the 26th Assault Boat Regiment was to attempt to land light infantry in the American rear by rowing across Nakagusuku Bay. Preparations began at dusk with stealthy infiltrations. Reconnaissance platoons advanced without firing, using ropes and poles marked with white rags to breach the minefields. At 3 a.m., after a short artillery salvo, barely 300 rounds, as the 75mm and 150mm reserves were at 40%, the whistles sounded and some 24,000 men emerged from the cave mouths. On the western sector, the 1st Battalion 22nd Regiment successfully waded across Makinato Inlet, took a surprise outpost of the U.S. 106th Infantry and advanced to the outskirts of Makinato Village, but was cut off when M4A3 Zippos with flamethrowers ignited it at close range. In the center, the U.S. 96th Infantry was stopped in its initial positions by the Japanese onslaught. but the Corps' artillery's response, 25 batteries firing timed tots at 144 barrels, sealed any penetration. On the right, the 272nd Independent Battalion stormed through the rice paddies of the Bishigawa Valley, breaking through the 7th Division's lines, hitting mortar positions, and causing confusion until dawn exposed it to 105mm shrapnel and 4.5-inch rocket barrages. The 27th Regiment's 22 tanks, attempting a night advance without lights between Kakazu and Nishibaru, fell into a flare-lit funnel. M10 tank destroyers and M9A1 bazookas set them ablaze one after another. At the same time, the 26th Regiment's boat force lost its element of surprise. SCR-602 radars detected the boats at 0410, and picket destroyers strafed them before they reached the shore. Less than a company managed to disembark and was annihilated by patrols of the 383rd Infantry. By dawn on May 4th, rain was pouring. The surviving infiltrators tried to dig in artillery pits but were hunted down one by portable flamethrowers and engineers with Bangalore charges. Within 24 hours, the attack petered out. Of the initial 76,000 defenders, approximately 7,000 were killed or disabled. The 24th Division lost a third of its infantry. The 62nd Division exhausted nearly all of its grenade reserves, and most critically, the last stock of 75mm and 150mm artillery ammunition, some 18,000 rounds, that Yahara had intended to ration for the final defense was consumed. American casualties were surprisingly light, 682 wounded and 17 tanks damaged, many by friendly fire in the confusion of the night. Military intelligence later found leaflets urging the breaking of the Yankee will with the sword of the spirit. American morale, however, was bolstered by the realization that the enemy could no longer launch coordinated offensives. From that moment on, Japanese artillery would fire fewer than 50 shells a day, and the frontline battalions would be reduced to skeleton companies surviving on raw rice and muddy water. The failed counterattack of May 3rd to 4th not only sealed the tactical fate of the 32nd Army, it marked the moment when Okinawa transformed from a battle of maneuver into an inexorable defensive dig-in and extermination operation. The torrential rains of May turned ravines into torrents, roads into quagmires, and trenches into ditches with a meter of water. On May 22nd, after 10 days of deluge, streams overflowed their banks and roads collapsed, but the pressure continued. Every rice bowl, every coral ridge was fought over hand-to-hand and with flamethrowers. The objective remained the Shuri Plateau. Advancing meter by meter on May 29th, the 22nd Marine Regiment took advantage of a Japanese withdrawal and, in coordination with the 5th, broke into the outskirts of Naha. At the same time, the 77th Division broke through the line, surprising even the 10th Army headquarters. That night, Shuri Castle Hill fell in blazing napalm fire. The position that had held 4 divisions back for 6 weeks collapsed in a matter of hours. Forced to withdraw, the 62nd Army established a temporary barrier south of Naha. On May 25th, it evacuated the Oroku Peninsula, while the 24th Division positioned itself on a new front along the west coast. Between May 30th and June 4th, it undertook a fighting withdrawal toward the final line in the Mabuni Hills. Rains again hampered the Allied advance, and the coastal highway was flooded. On June 4th, the 6th Marine Division bypassed the Naha estuary with an amphibious assault from the shoreline, the last amphibious operation of World War II. 2 days later, the 4th and 29th Marines landed south of the port to envelop the peninsula. The remnants of the defending Imperial Navy were almost completely destroyed. To the north, the 2nd and 3rd platoons of the 8th Marines had returned from Saipan, capturing Ushijima on June 3rd and Aguni on the 9th. This sealed off any remaining Japanese refuge. On the flanks, patrols of the 7th Marines, already seasoned by night ambushes, encountered the post-combat Okinawan guerrillas mixed with Imperial soldiers, but organized resistance was crumbling. On June 21st, after weeks of fighting on the Mabuni escarpment and under relentless bombardment, the white banners began to appear among the limestone rocks. General Mitsuru Ushijima and his chief of staff, Isamu Cho, committed suicide at midnight. Colonel Yahara, obeying orders, was the highest-ranking officer to surrender. The battle had cost the United States more than 12,500 dead and 55,000 wounded. Japan lost some 110,000 combatants and at least 80,000 civilians, while tens of thousands of islanders were left homeless. Still, the operation achieved its objective. With Okinawa in Allied hands, B-29s could take off under escort. The ports sheltered 1,300 ships, and heavy artillery was now aimed at the heart of the metropolitan archipelago. The price of that victory foreshadowed the magnitude of the sacrifice that assaulting the main islands would have entailed and, at the same time, anticipated the urgency of seeking a quick and definitive end to the war. After the loss of Shuri, the remnants of the 32nd Army withdrew to the southern tip of the island, between Itoman, the Kian Peninsula and the coastal hills of Mabuni. By June 11th, only scattered pockets remained within the Allied perimeter. On the 15th, the 8th Marines landed at the devastated port of Naha and relieved the exhausted 1st Division to clear the ruined street by street, while Lieutenant General Roy Geiger, the only Marine Corps officer to command a field army, assumed control following the death of Simon Buckner. 5 days later, General Joseph Stilwell took over permanently. The assault divisions had been so reduced that barely 5 fresh battalions remained in reserve. On June 17th, the 7th Division destroyed the 44th Mixed Brigade stronghold on Hill 115, southwest of Nakaza. The 96th Regiment was withdrawn for a few days to neutralize a 24th Division pocket at Madeira and Makabe. It did not surrender until June 22nd, when the 6th Marine Division cleared the western coast and the 1st Marine Division eradicated the last pockets of the 62nd Division near Kiyamu-Gusuku Ridge. The 7th closed the encirclement around the enemy headquarters below Hill 89 at Mabuni, where survivors of the 24th were still holding out. At 3 a.m. on June 22nd, Mitsuru Ushijima and Isamu Cho committed suicide in a cave on the southern slope. Their staffs followed suit between the 22nd and 30th. That same June 22nd, the U.S. command declared organized resistance over, although loose weapons continued for days. Kumeshima, 55 kilometers to the west, was occupied by amphibious scouts and converted into a radar station. The entire campaign had lasted 82 days. The Marines suffered 2,938 dead and missing and 16,017 wounded. The Army, 4,675 dead and 18,099 wounded. The naval forces suffered the highest casualty rate of the war, 4,900 killed or missing and 4,800 wounded, with 36 ships sunk and 368 damaged, 43 beyond recovery, by suicide waves. The British carrier force lost 4 ships damaged and 98 aircraft, with 62 dead. 7 Army divisions and 2 Marine divisions absorbed 12,927 and 11,147 replacements, respectively. On the Japanese side, barely 10,000 regular soldiers and 8,000 Okinawan conscripts survived. Some 110,000 combatants died. 7,830 aircraft were lost, 4,155 in combat, 2,655 in accidents, 1,020 on the ground, and 4,600 kamikaze pilots went down with their aircraft. The naval toll totaled 16 ships sunk and 4 damaged, including the Yamato, with 3,650 sailors drowned. Military authorities counted 285,272 civilians. Between 42,000 and 50,000 perished directly, although post-war studies put the total at over 122,000, almost a third of the indigenous population, exceeding the combined death toll of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The local culture was devastated. After the fighting ended, 2 white-painted Betty bombers flew from Tokyo to Ieshima on August 19th with the surrender plenipotentiaries. A misunderstanding left them without fuel on their return, but they were rescued and conveyed the terms of surrender to the emperor. Thousands of soldiers, previously determined to die, began to surrender. By November 1945, 16,350 had surrendered. On August 10th, Japan announced its intention to surrender, and on August 29th, the last garrisons of Karama followed suit. On September 7th, the Ryukyu were officially handed over at Kadena to Vice Admiral Tasuku Kato and Lieutenant General Toshiro Nomi. Some 105,000 troops remained scattered across smaller islands, and small insurgent groups would operate until 1947. The United States installed an occupation force of 87,000 men and began transforming the island into a gigantic logistical enclave. 22 airfields were planned to accommodate the 8th Air Force arriving from Europe and naval aircraft. Only part of it was completed, but the 3,000 meters or 10,000 feet airfields at Awas and Chimu, or those at Ieshima and Bolo, became common. Batenko Bay became a Navy operational base, later renamed White Beach. Naha, Chimu, Nakagusuku, and Bukna Bay grew to become the largest staging ports prior to the planned invasion of Japan. The typhoons of September and October forced the relocation of several facilities, but the experience made Okinawa a logistical hub during the Korean War and later for air operations in Vietnam and strategic projection into Asia well into the 1970s. Military administration passed from the Navy to the Army and, beginning in 1946, was gradually transferred to Okinawan civilian authorities, although tension over the presence of foreign troops never disappeared. On May 15, 1972, the United States formally returned the islands to Japan. Some 39 military compounds were leased for American use and replaced by units of the Japanese self-defense forces. Okinawa, ravaged by weeks of artillery and naval gunfire, then saw cranes and bulldozers replace the limestone caves and sugarcane fields with concrete runways and steel piers. A constant reminder that, for 82 days in 1945, modern warfare showed the price it would have taken to set foot on the archipelago's mother islands.